I think we all know Beverly Diamond, who's been the Canada Research Chair in Traditional Music at Memorial University for 14 years, and who's going to be retiring later this year. She has been a leader in the field internationally. She's currently the president of the Society for Ethnomusicology, and she is a member of the Exhibiting Sound research team, as is Jeff and Rishkoff, she has agreed to provide a plenary that will both discuss some of her experiences working with a variety of communities over her career, but also touch upon what we've been discussing for the last 2 years, and then we'll have some time for discussion.
Okay, good. All right, everyone. One final shout out to Marcia and to Brittany and to all of the others who have contributed to organizing this wonderful couple of days. It's just been great. I'm sure we're all going away with so many ideas and things we want to check out. I was at a conference a week ago where the person who was kind of charged with doing what I've been asked to do, which is in some way attempt some sort of a summary or a response or a look at where we might go for the future, started out by saying that he didn't want to be the one who delayed the reception, and then of course he was. So I kind of feel like I'm in the, in this difficult position. So I'm going to look around, and if you start looking very thirsty, maybe I'll just stop then. And if you don't get my attention, put up your hand and also, since so many of you have done such interesting media-rich things, I couldn't resist at least bringing 1 or 2 pretty pictures. And this is not a sophisticated presentation at all, but the first one, which is quite seriously a pretty picture, is not entirely gratuitous, as you will see. Okay, that's it. No, nothing about that first, just a pretty picture. So anyway, with this fascinating array of presentations over the couple of days, there's a lot to think about, and I wanted to return to the very beginning of Jeff Titan's keynote, where he reminded us that curating comes from the Latin cura, for care. If we look a little more in detail at the etymological history, however, we find some kind of interesting nuances that are relevant to what we've been talking about. For instance, as you might know, curate is an assistant priest in lots of varieties of European Christianity, a figure who may have cared a lot for his flock, another word that's kind of an interesting connotation of following and having very little agency, but someone who also held power that was selective and often coercive. I learned by Googling, of course, that there's such a thing as a curate's aide, a phrase coined by the British satirical magazine Punch in the 1890s. The caption on the cartoon that described the curate's aide showed a dinner party, basically, and the host said to the curate, "I'm afraid you've got a bad egg there, Mr. Jones," with the curate's name. And the curate, who was trying to be terribly polite, said, "Oh no, I assure you, parts of it are excellent." So anyway, curate's egg means something that is simultaneously good and bad, and this is something I think to think very carefully about in relation to curatorial practice. What are the elements that may sustain but that may have some problems as well. The same root of the word curare refers to the poison used on arrows in South American indigenous cultures. Probably, it seems, to have been a Spanish mishearing of an indigenous word that we seem to have lost. And I want to return to the issue of mishearing in a moment, because I think it's a really important issue for us. And of course, there's an issue of who cares about whom. So those different nuances then point to many of the projects you've described, some offering what you care about, others looking more closely at agency, selection processes, platforms that allow for indigenous protocols, and there may even be possibly some reflections on how to find the parts of the egg that are still good. It is hardly news to this crowd that while caregiving may be well-intentioned, it is in every case power-laden and sometimes has negative as well as positive effects. And we certainly see that particularly with indigenous projects where communities have been misrepresented so often that there are very legitimate needs for not wanting to open certain kinds of knowledge. One thing that we might want to discuss is how these projects, let me just stop at the word project there for a moment. It's so interesting, we've had 2 days of projects, and I think in project-driven worlds, we already have an interesting problem for sustainability, which is something we've been talking about rather a lot. It's hard to get funding that extends for long periods of time. They're only good for the duration of the initial project, and some of you have pointed to this, these issues of how you keep things current, how you migrate the technology. So projects is already interesting, but nevertheless, almost all your projects relate to the broader field of memory cultures, ones that commemorate and memorialize, but also rethink public memory in ways relevant to the present and future. Some of them, the Cape Breton initiatives we heard about yesterday, the digital project, to name a couple, emerge from clear local desires to sustain and make resilient cultural traditions and histories for uses in the present and the future. Other projects, such as Marcia's, I think aim to recover information too often ignored in the narratives of regional and national identity. And I think that Marcia's is the one that comes to mind, but there's quite a number of very local projects that are important in that regard. In a way, counter-narratives to regional and national identity narratives are important. And of course, we saw this morning the refreshingly disruptive work of Peter Morin, as described by Dylan. I think had she been here, Sharon Lierendale's work would be more like an offering of love and respect through song. And I don't think we want to put aside that too is a really, really important motivation for exhibiting sound. She certainly made very generous offerings of song to the residents of the impoverished area of downtown Eastside Vancouver. And at the same time, a kind of response to such things as the violence of urban development. I really admire your thoughtfulness about the work you do. You're contributing to what the late communications scholar Roger Simon calls a critical pedagogy of remembrance. He writes, quote, "Practices of remembrance are questions of and for history as a force of inhabitation, as the way we live with images and stories, we would add sound, that intertwine with our sense of limits and possibilities, hopes and fears, identities and distinctions." So I want to return to those things a little bit later. What are the limits and possibilities of how we tell our stories, the hopes and fears surrounding them, the identities and distinctions that they make. Of course, Indigenous approaches are among those that further insist that remembrance is one with the vision of the present and the future. So this collapsing and this recursiveness of time, I think, is something that now in the digital era we can do probably, or at least we can think about more creatively than we could think about when we were kind of restricted to linear formats. I was thinking that we might want to think about models for all of us that we could honor in a way that would take us out of the academic world. And one that I did think about very quickly, and I'm not sure but this is a good idea, are the 7 traditional teachings of many First Nations, a pattern that was used by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada over the past 6 years. The 7 flames in the circle, as the little commentary explains, tell us how they kept love, respect, courage, honesty, wisdom, humility, and truth at the center of their process. And I'm not suggesting that we should be appropriating First Nations traditions, but I think in this case, these are relational principles. And we could honor the fact that First Nations and Indigenous peoples have had a set of really fine relational principles that could inform our practices, and we could acknowledge that in our work. What I thought I would do to perhaps stimulate some discussion, though, is to suggest to you that I think one of the most important things that both scholars and artists do is to open up dialogue, to recognize different kinds of knowledge as legitimate, different embodied experiences of those limits and possibilities, hopes and fears, identities and distinctions that Roger Simons writes about. And even saying this is controversial, because I think in communities where where there's a sense that there should be an archive that's closed for their own use, there's not much desire to open up a dialogue at this point beyond the community itself. But within the community, yes. So I'd like to have us have a conversation about future possibilities for broader dialogues. Maybe across generations, since experiences are now so fundamentally different, across culturally, politically, and individually diverse people who hold different kinds of knowledge, have different histories, political affiliations, values, beliefs. And I think if we were to do that, we may need to allow for new ways of thinking about vulnerability. A few of us have tossed this around at dinner last night, if you think a few other places. To feel vulnerable is often to seek alliances, and out of that, healthy change. Vulnerability makes us good listeners. So that's one area that we might want to think about. We are, in fact, vulnerable to big forces that I think are not giving us a chance to listen, not giving us a chance to have a voice. But in other places, in smaller contexts, I think vulnerability and the admission of vulnerability can be quite positive. The second thing, and the thing that I'll just make a few more comments about before we finish, is the concept of regime changes. And you can tell I had Jeff's text before I heard the rest of you, so I wrote a few of these comments on the basis of Jeff's text and thought, well, I'll spin off and see how other people sort of followed on this. Jeff presented the idea of regime changes compellingly in his keynote, but as I listen to you all, I've been reflecting on how differently situated people find evidence or even recognize regime changes. What is one? And I have to think, aren't some regime changes good? Maybe it helps from time to time to let a musical style go and to adopt one that enables social interaction that is more fulfilling, that enables a way of being in a community that might be more sustainable at a current moment. This is, I know, not an idea that we tend to like to admit sometimes, but there may simply be some instances where that may be true. And many times, of course, there are some people, the string band revivalists, who deny change, but also who love dynamism and innovation. So there's often people within communities who are constantly suggesting, oh no, they're authentic, no, they're authentic. No. So how those arguments play out are the very things that we need to bring those people into the same room to have conversations that about what the basis is for what they hold so dearly as their position on change. The arguments are different kinds of truth claims about change. So truth claims about change might be kind of an interesting thing. And sometimes I think these small debates about authenticity, for instance, miss the real regime changes, huge economic shifts, neoliberalism, policy far away that affects the local, those sorts of things. Two of the places where I think the conversation about regime changes are particularly complicated are temporalities on one hand and technologies on the other. We've heard a lot about both over the last couple of days. So temporalities and regime changes. That iceberg on the slide, for instance, this is a pretty simple-minded example, but to some extent, the icebergs that come past my door in St. John's are part of a regular change of season, the warming that comes after winter. We worry when we don't see the icebergs, however, is something else going on. And then the scientists tell us, oh no, it was just that the currents took them further out and so they're not visible from the shore. Don't worry, they say. Well, of course we all worry because I think at this point the evidence is pretty incontrovertible. Did I say that right? That the ice caps are degrading at an alarming rate. This is a form of environmental change then on a massive scale is a form of slow violence, as ecologist Rob Nixon describes it. Violence that can easily escape close observation. It takes a bigger picture. And violence that garners little attention until it becomes a crisis. Nixon equates the slow violence of ecological regimes, and I had another picture of that iceberg, equates the slow violence of ecological regimes also with social ones. And colonialism is, of course, the prime example of a system of long duration whose impact accumulated silently without media attention. And with that, settler privilege, racism, and some other social ills that are so deeply ingrained still. My point here is that there's simultaneously multiple temporal regimes at play. So which one is going to really change the world? Often we look at the small ones and miss the big ones that are the real regime change. Some may be stable in the short term, but massive forces may be undermining cultures in the long term. And what I'm suggesting here is that we might discuss how curatorial projects can help us understand the different temporalities, the different mechanisms and time frames of change. And one way of thinking about this, and this is again not a very profound way, but one thing that we've been thinking about in St. John's, in a project that we've been doing at the MAP Research Center since 2009, is to think not just of storying the land, as many of you have been doing, but restorying it, juxtaposing different narratives over time of changing spaces, and there's been several examples of that here today. Most of you emphasize place, so the idea of restoring land as opposed to restoring something else seems to make sense. We've been explicitly looking at places in and near St. John's and beyond, restoring the places from the diverse cultural perspectives and points in time. It was originally came out of an oral history project where we did about 100 oral histories with ethnoculturally diverse citizens in the community. Then we met with a lot of organizations, indigenous organizations, immigrant organizations, museum sector people, to think a little bit about how we can go forward. And what they suggested to us was that we needed some sort of real mobile means of talking about stories that carried change, that were the embodiment of change. So what we've decided to do, as some of you have already been doing, is to create a phone app that would go with a walking tour and an online exhibit. So you can walk around the city then and hear some bits of the oral history about what this particular building was doing in the 1940s as opposed to what it might be doing now. Here, for instance, we see a little story that was owned by the father of Lorraine Michael, who somebody might know because she has been until recently the NDP leader of in the province. And it was the first store where you could get certain food materials that you couldn't find at grocery stores, that kind of thing. And you could get grape leaves and olives and other things. In the 40s and 50s, that particular location now has $1 million condos in its place, a common story where urban development wipes out some of the histories of certain communities, of course. You can walk by the 11-foot, I think it's even more than that, high sculpture, which is called the Gate. It's now located on the waterfront, although here it's in the studio. It was made by Bulgarian artist Lubin Voykov, who you see there, and it was a statue or a sculpture that he made to pay homage to the northern route. The northern route was what flights that were channeled through Gander, Newfoundland were called, and it was a main route for refugees entering North America in the mid-20th century. So there's many stories, for instance, about refugees from the former Soviet republics, including Voykov's family, from Vietnam and elsewhere, who all arrived through that Gander, Newfoundland. I think the planes ran out of gas before they got to mainland North America, and so they had to stop in Gander. That's why it had that particular status there. Some of the multiple stories, whoops, we'll skip that one, show how a single space enables multiple sovereign cultures to coexist. Middle Cove Beach, for instance, where Iranians celebrate Nowruz, New Year, by building campfires, jumping over them as a symbol of new life in the spring. We're in a little bit later in the spring, the capelin arrived, as you see in the top left-hand corner, and families come out with small nets, including very young children wading into the cold North Atlantic, which is always a little scary for me, but picking capelin, the little fish that the whales are after, picking capelin out of the sea, building a campfire on shore and having dinner. So you can't get anywhere near the beach at the time when the capelin come in because this is a pretty popular event. A little bit more delimited in terms of who is involved is in the early fall when the South Asian Hindu community throws little clay figures of the elephant head of Ganesh into the sea. the end of the Purification Festival, Ganesh Chaturthi. So this is a place then where almost, well, many communities come and establish their own specific histories and traditions, one after the other as the seasons roll by. So they point to the changing demographics of community, perhaps, the changes in lived cultural practices in response to place. Of course, some of the place narratives tell stories of silences and histories lost. Shaunaditit is, as many of you know, usually described in settler history as the last of the Beothuk First Nation. But the story is compellingly challenged by many Aboriginal Newfoundlanders who don't believe all of that lasting nonsense, knowing that they are of Beothuk descent. She contributed valuable information about her people through drawings such as the one you see here. Her remains, it was not known for a long time where she was buried, but her remains were unearthed when they built the road that you see in the picture at the back, Southside Road along the back of the harbor. And we know that she was buried then at the foot of Southside Hills in St. John's. Incidentally, the same area where ammunition was also buried during World War II when Newfoundlanders feared a German attack. It was only in 2007 when a plaque recognizing Shaunaditit, which you see in the lower right, was unveiled, and it was the first commemorative act that marked the beginning of an Aboriginal resurgence in Newfoundland that has emerged later in Newfoundland than in other provinces, but quite quickly in the last 8 or 9 years. So this idea of retranscribing the text of the place, restoring the place, then might be a way to get at some of these different temporalities and the regime changes that brought them there. So we might also think a little bit about technologies and regime changes. And this is the last point I thought I'd make before we have a little conversation. I return first of all to that issue of mishearing that was mentioned at the beginning when the Spanish misheard an indigenous word for whatever the people were putting on the ends of the arrows as a way of killing the things that they were their enemies as well as certain predators. Anna Maria Ochoa-Gautier, in her important book Orality, has recently described mishearing as an audible technique and a political tool that has been central to intercultural control throughout history. And she makes a really big point of returning to the idea of how we either intentionally or unintentionally mishear. One of her simple examples is that indigenous linguistic sounds, for instance, often had sonic dimensions that you couldn't transcribe into Spanish, understandably, but the Spanish were the elite that was kind of defining who basically had any authority. And not only then was the impossibility of transcribing indigenous languages regarded as unlettered, it was even at times regarded as less than human in 19th century Colombia. So it was one way in which then the idea that the technology of print established conditions of citizenship, basically. Audio recording, too, is a means of inscribing with lots of potential for mishearing. We all know that. We know, for instance, that media both disseminates cultural material, but also establishes what we come to accept as good or bad sound. A few years ago, Anthony Seeger suggested that we're making more and more bad recordings. And I think that that was a period where a lot of us were using movie cameras that were sort of home use, not very professional, and sound had somehow not become all that good. Earlier on, we often have archival recordings that were just, that have degraded, and they don't have the audio quality that we think of as good sound. And again, the mishearing of hearing that quality of sound can be to transfer that to the people and suggest that somehow it is not good singing rather than just not 21st century sound. If you've read Jonathan Stern's account of the testing of the MP3 format, you'll know how much trouble big companies use to test the sound that they think is going to be most pleasant for listeners. The listeners who do the testing are generally male, white engineering types. So, you know, again, there may be certain bias in that, I'll leave that up to you. But anyway, we are shaped by the technologies we use. I worry about this because at my research center, we've been making archival recordings at the request of the local community. They want to have more access to some of these materials. So our motives are good, but sometimes if we have a really important song, for instance, and we don't have a good archival recording, we have been commissioning a new one by local singers. We kind of like the idea of putting new performers together with older performers. It breaks down this idea of source singers and contemporary singers or authentic singers and revivalists. It kind of blurs those lines in interesting ways. But I worry about this idea of mishearing. How are those two kinds of sound listened to back to back? One of the things that we're working on right now is a recording of Labrador Inuit Moravian music. Labrador Inuit were Christianized by Moravians in the 17th century, and many of their traditions are recognized by them as their own. They made their own hymns, they made their own arrangements, they played the instrumental parts quite well. Of course it's controversial. There are many people in the community that don't accept Christianity and that see the kind of colonizing influences that it's had in the community. But still, there's others that feel that this is an important tradition. So we're working on this recording. People will talk a little bit about the vocal sounds as being sonic lineages. They hear the sounds of individual families who have literally for 300 years carried this tradition. And they want to hear the specificity of that. They want to hear the Dicker family and the Obed family and the Hope family. So the sound doesn't blend very well as a result of that particular aesthetic. I'll just play you a little example. Some of you may have heard this way of singing before. This is quite short. Oh, sorry, I can't do it. I didn't put it. Oh yes, we did put the sound in.
You reached the bottom sound.
Where is it plugged into the speaker? Well, look, I don't want to waste time playing around with that. I think you get the point that music that has a distinctive aesthetic then could be misheard in very interesting ways. And I think this is the kind of thing in our curatorial projects that we need to talk about. What shapes vocal aesthetics? What shapes ensemble playing aesthetics? What even shapes the concept of where the songs are from, what they might be responding to? There's all kinds of ways of kind of making mishearing then a topic of conversation rather than something that's simply quietly done in the background. Okay, I wanted also, with regard to mishearing, to mention some of the curatorial projects that are in Indigenous languages, in the Gaelic language project that we heard about the other day. I particularly liked the Gaelic project's discussion of witnessing as a way that outsiders could enter that material. And this came up again, Dylan was talking, I think, about witnessing as a very important interactive mechanism, and one we need to think of as actually something that we are all responsible for. We're all responsible to some extent for good witnessing. But I think that witnessing is, in some ways, a great technique for improving the listening and viewing skills of outsiders, but without allowing them to have any impact on decision making. It's this kind of non-intrusive way of starting to appreciate different cultural values. So basically, I guess I would like to see more curatorial thinking about the ways we mishear, intentionally or not, and the way projects of cultural representation might either guard against mishearing or show it up by explaining the rationale for different aesthetic preferences. We've seen quite a lot about the way technologies reconfigure selves and socialities. Many of you have offered highly creative approaches to using media in the presentation of culture, mapping, wonder worlds of avatars, interactive point of view video, which was done so brilliantly this morning by Dana. We could have further discussion about how technology is a technology of the self, as Foucault would label it, a regime that changes the way we are in the world. We might think about digital exhibits as compared to physical ones, or, and I think again, the NFB material, I think, is going to help us all think through who we are as users, how we interact with technology, so I think that will be really, really useful for us. I just came also last week from a project where I was evaluating a whole bunch of proposals for digital humanities projects, and I was struck by the fact that so many of them simply are designed to make things available, obscuring the nature of the research, selection processes, kind of more or less refusing the curatorial role. And so I think that perhaps ethnomusicologists have a role to play in advising the range of digital humanities communities about such things as odd-idle technologies that inscribe citizenship, listening as valuing, those sorts of issues. Of course, there's also the temporalities of the technologies that several of you acknowledged. My students, of course, change the technologies that they prefer about every 2 years. And I've heard some of you say things like, you don't know what the young people are playing now, or somebody referred to 2007 as back then, which when you're my age seems really strange, but oh well. But then who would also have guessed that cassettes and vinyl would be coming back in 2015, or that even, I understand, wax cylinder recorders are selling like they've never sold before, you know? So there's this desire both for, you know, this incredible slippage of time where technology is concerned, and this incredible sense that we can never sort of keep up, that it's going to be constantly changing. This is certainly something that we could talk about more. I do admire some of the projects, such as the ones that Jennifer and Amber were talking about, that are really aiming for good approaches to sustainable digital technologies. I think that's so helpful for all of us. But we do have this very odd context in which technological change is constant and going in different directions at the same time. So I guess I'd just like to sort of finish up by suggesting that I think we need to think bigger than our immediate projects, as we always do, to consider how conversations among diverse constituents would be useful in arriving at good decisions about cultural sustainability, strategies of resilience, and innovative cultural development. Reminded of Jennifer's comment about it's community that's important at the beginning, in the middle, and the end. I'm misquoting you, Jennifer, I apologize, but I agree with that, but I think our community is, in many, many cases, going to be larger than a specific locale. It's going to be communities with different interests that we need to talk about in different places to get a sense of where what we're doing might be informed by good practices elsewhere. So I'd like to see those old regular Baptists in conversation with the string band revivalists, or the African American blues players, or the indigenous groups whose land they are on. I'd like to listen to more heritage tourism promoters whose aims may initially seem too crassly commercial, but who, as we heard from the Lewisburg representative yesterday, who are often open to interacting with community. I'd like to ask when and why dominant styles do emerge in communities, and how dissenters who don't like those styles are able to function when that happens. Dissenters and also people who simply prefer something else. And in short, while goals of conservation and access remain very important as tools of public memory, I'd like to see more curatorial work that shakes assumptions and encourages us to see different points of view, to test what consensus building